It was a soft summer morning in the village of High March, the kind that stirred old women to sweep their doorsteps before breakfast and made the butcher whistle while setting out his shopfront display. Bees danced among the lavender bushes. The vicar's wife was already tending her dahlias, and a faint smell of warm bread drifted from the bakehouse on Mill Lane. All was precisely as it should be, peaceful, orderly, and, above all, proper. At 10:30, in a modest cottage nestled behind the churchyard, Miss Jane Marple took her seat by the window. A small tray beside her held weak tea, 2 slices of brown toast, and a dish of strawberry preserve. She buttered one slice carefully while watching the procession of village life go by. A dog barked once. Miss Hartnell's niece, in that absurd London skirt, cycled past with a rolled-up blanket under her arm, likely heading to the picnic. That reminded Miss Marple she had been invited too, by none other than young Charlotte Woodhouse of Havisham Rise, who had returned from her travels with ideas of community and spirit and decided to host a village picnic to bring everyone together. A charming notion, if one overlooked the underlying tensions among several of the invitees. Havisham Rise, a rather grand estate by village standards, had once belonged to Colonel Braddock, retired from India, fierce about roses, and dead these 10 years. His niece Charlotte had inherited the house, though not, it was murmured, without contest from distant cousins. She had modernized it, painted it white, added sun loungers on the lawn, and filled it with bright linen from Provence and peculiar art from Morocco. The villagers viewed it all with the kind of tolerant amusement they reserved for newcomers with large ideas and too much luggage. By noon, most of High March had gathered on the grounds of Havisham Rise. The afternoon sun filtered through the chestnut trees, and a long table had been set with sandwiches, sponge cakes, and jugs of lemonade. Miss Marple, escorted by the always dutiful Mrs. Weatherby, found herself seated between Mr. Edgecombe, the solicitor, dry as toast and twice as brittle, and little Miss Linton, who taught piano and never spoke above a whisper. They had just begun discussing a curious item in the morning paper, something about a missing actress from Exeter, when Charlotte Woodhouse called for attention. She was wearing a large straw hat and a yellow dress that rustled as she moved. "I'm so thrilled to see you all," she beamed. "I thought we might start with a few parlour games to get everyone mixing, then perhaps a tour of the house." "Some of you haven't seen the renovations." There was polite applause, murmurs of assent. As Miss Marple nibbled a slice of seed cake, she observed the gathering with her usual discretion. There was Reverend March, who kept fiddling with his collar, clearly uncomfortable in the heat. His daughter Lucy sat stiffly by the punch bowl, pointedly ignoring Gerald Ames, the village doctor's son, who had recently returned from a stint in Wales under circumstances that hadn't quite been explained. Old Mrs. Hemmings, always quick to disapprove, had already narrowed her eyes at Charlotte's modern sculpture on the terrace. It was, Miss Marple thought, a most successful afternoon. Until, of course, the scream. It came from the house, a high, frightened scream, followed by a horrid silence. Everyone stood at once. A glass shattered. Mrs. Weatherby clutched her pearls. Charlotte Woodhouse turned white as the tablecloths. "It's Nora," someone whispered. "Nora Ambrose." Indeed, it was. A moment later, Nora appeared in the French doorway, her hand trembling against the glass. Someone's in the guest room on the bed," she swallowed. "Dead." Gasps. The doctor pushed forward, already on the move. Several villagers followed him in, a poor instinct, Miss Marple noted, and one that would muddle things in no time. Miss Marple herself did not rush. She never did. Instead, she placed her teacup gently on its saucer and stood with quiet dignity. While the others surged toward the house, she took a longer path round the side, past the lavender and up through the side entrance. Inside, confusion reigned. The hallway echoed with voices. Someone was crying. The doctor emerged from the guest room, his face unusually grim, dead, yes, strangled, with a scarf. No sign of forced entry. "Who is it?" Charlotte asked, pale as milk. "A man. Mid-40s, I'd say. Never seen him before." "But that room wasn't occupied," Charlotte protested. "No one was staying there. I made up the bed myself." "Yesterday." Inspector Granger arrived soon after, summoned by the Woodhouse housekeeper. A capable man with a large moustache and a fondness for quick conclusions, he listened, frowned, and declared, "Well, someone did sleep in it last night." "That bed's clearly been used. Sheets all wrinkled. Someone changed their mind about the guest list, it seems." "Or someone didn't want the poor man noticed until it was too late," Miss Marple murmured softly, almost to herself. She received a sidelong glance from the inspector. "You saw anything, Miss Marple?" "No," she said mildly. "Only, it's odd." The corner of the bedspread was folded back very neatly, as if someone had turned down the bed in preparation, but only on one side. As though they expected just one person, a single guest, or perhaps, she looked thoughtfully down the hall, a very deliberate impression of one. The inspector gave a grunt. "We'll get the man identified soon enough. Meanwhile, no, one's to leave." And just like that, the picnic turned into something else entirely. A puzzle, a murder, and a gathering of people who suddenly didn't seem quite so ordinary anymore. Miss Marple folded her hands and returned to her chair. In the drawing room, eyes resting gently on the open door to the guest room. "Strangled in a bed," she said almost dreamily. But no one heard a sound. No one saw him arrive. And the bed was not supposed to have been slept in at all. She sipped her tea. "Now that," she murmured, "is very curious indeed." Miss Marple remained seated in the drawing room of Havisham Rise, her delicate hands folded atop her handbag, eyes fixed not on the bustle around her, but on a vase of lilies placed on the windowsill. She was thinking, not so much about the dead man, unknown, middle-aged, and found strangled in an unused guest bed, but about the nature of people, and how often their intentions revealed more than their actions. In the hallway, Inspector Granger's voice rang out again, brisk and authoritative. "Dr. Ames, you're sure of the cause?" "As sure as I can be at a glance," came the answer, young Gerald Ames, sounding both earnest and uncertain. "There are contusions around the neck consistent with a scarf or cord. No signs of a struggle, no blood." Miss Marple gently rose and crossed to the archway, pausing just beyond view. She had always found that people spoke more freely when they thought no one truly listening. "No identification on him," Granger muttered. "No wallet, not even a coat." "That's odd," said Charlotte, still pale but composed now. The bedrooms were locked last night. I always check before I go to bed. I know that room was shut." Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately and stepped forward. "Forgive me, but when you say locked, do you mean locked from the inside or from without?" Charlotte blinked at her. "From the outside, with a key. I always lock the guest rooms that aren't being used. Mrs. Beckett, my housekeeper, has a copy of the keys." The inspector turned. "And Mrs. Beckett, where is she now?" "She went home after laying out breakfast. She only lives at the bottom of the drive." "Right." Granger nodded to the constable. "Go fetch her." He turned back to Charlotte. "And only you and the housekeeper had keys?" Charlotte hesitated. "I believe so. Unless—" She frowned. "Well, there was a set in the sideboard drawer, but anyone could have taken those." Granger's jaw tightened. "A full list of guests, please, everyone who was invited and everyone who came. If someone wasn't on your list, I want to know." As the inspector began issuing further instructions, Miss Marple drifted quietly out to the veranda. The party-goers, guests now transformed into uneasy witnesses, stood clustered in groups beneath the shade of the beeches, their teacups abandoned, their conversation hushed. No one had yet left. Granger had ordered them to remain until the initial statements were taken. Miss Marple made her way to a group near the sundial, where the vicar and his daughter Lucy stood with Miss Linton and Mr. Edgecombe, the solicitor. "It's all rather beastly, isn't it?" murmured Lucy, twisting her gloves. "To think someone was lying dead in the house the whole time we were playing charades." "It doesn't bear thinking of," said Miss Linton faintly. The vicar gave a pious sigh. "Strange business, very strange indeed. Though I must say, this sort of thing never happens unless there's a reason." Miss Marple smiled gently. "So often that is precisely the case, Reverend. But reasons, I find, are not always the ones we expect." Mr. Edgecombe cleared his throat. "And what do you expect, Miss Marple?" "Oh, I rarely expect anything," she replied with that infuriating mildness that so often masked her precision. "But I did notice something curious. The bed in which the poor man was found. Charlotte said she made it herself. Fresh sheets, tight corners, and yet there were 2 indentations on the pillows." There was a pause. Lucy looked at her sharply. "2? But the man was alone." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her eyes thoughtful. "Alone when he was found." She turned, leaving that seed of suggestion behind, and wandered toward the house again. Through the open window she could hear raised voices. From the dining room, where Granger had set up his temporary command. "I don't care if he said he was an old friend of the family, you don't let strangers in without checking." That was Charlotte, unmistakably furious. Then Mrs. Beckett's defensive tone. "But he had a key, Miss Charlotte. Said he was staying just one night, didn't want to cause a fuss. Had your name and everything. How was I to know?" Miss Marple stepped inside as Charlotte came storming down the hall, face tight with indignation. "Miss Marple," she said, sharply, stopping when she saw her. "You heard?" "I heard enough. I can't believe it. She let him in, without telling me. Said he arrived just after dusk, claimed to be an old friend of Uncle Alfred's. That's nonsense, of course. I didn't know the man at all. Yet he had your name, and a key." "Yes," Charlotte said grimly, "which means he'd been planning this, or someone else had. The key must have been taken from the sideboard." Miss Marple nodded. "And who would you say was in the house last evening before dark?" Charlotte paused. "Well, most of the preparations were outside, but let me see. Nora helped set the table. She might have gone inside. Gerald came early, brought wine. Lucy and the vicar came with the scones. Oh, and Mr. Edgecombe popped in briefly. Said he had a question about the land registry documents I was asking about." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And did anyone notice if he lingered?" Charlotte frowned. "I suppose he might have been alone in the dining room for a moment. He was looking through his briefcase. At that moment the inspector appeared at the end of the corridor. Miss Marple, you've a knack for hearing what shouldn't be overheard. If you're going to poke about, I may as well know what you think." Miss Marple gave him a benign smile. "I think," she said delicately, "that someone invited that poor man to the house under false pretenses. I think they arranged for him to arrive quietly, under the cover of assumed familiarity. And I think he intended to stay the night, perhaps even expected company, before something went terribly wrong." Granger frowned. "So you're saying the victim wasn't an intruder? He was brought here?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, and quite deliberately. "The question is, by whom and why?" Granger ran a hand through his hair. "That's what I mean to find out." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "I'd be very curious to know whether Mr. Edgecombe has ever done any legal work involving impersonation or fraudulent identity. He's clever, perhaps a little too clever, and he's been unusually quiet." "Edgecombe?" Granger asked. "He's as dry as his ledgers." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but even the driest of men can have secrets, and the driest are often the most flammable when you strike the right match." Outside, the wind stirred the tablecloths on the abandoned picnic tables. The food sat untouched, the jugs of lemonade now warm beneath the sun. Miss Marple returned to her chair near the window, her eyes scanning the garden where the guests lingered in nervous groups. Someone among them knew exactly why the man had come to Havisham Rise. Someone had either expected him or feared him. Miss Marple smoothed her skirt and folded her hands once more. She had seen enough to know this murder hadn't been the result of chance. It had been staged, deliberately, carefully, and with a touch of familiarity that suggested old acquaintance. The kind of acquaintance that in a small village like High March could have gone unnoticed for years, hidden in plain sight, quiet as a bed that wasn't meant to be slept in. A subtle breeze stirred the curtains in the drawing-room, and Miss Marple, still seated by the window, watched as Mr. Edgecombe walked briskly along the garden path, a faint sheen on his brow, despite the mildness of the day. He stopped to speak briefly with Reverend Mullins, nodded curtly to Lucy, and made his way toward the veranda with the air of a man trying not to appear too interested in the investigation. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles as he approached. "Mr. Edgecombe," she said with a gentle smile, "such a curious morning, isn't it? One wouldn't expect a corpse in the guest bedroom of a lovely house like this. And yet—" Edgecombe, caught mid-step, forced a polite smile. "Yes, quite unsettling. One never imagined such things happening during a garden party." "No, one doesn't," Miss Marple agreed, "though it's the sort of thing that might make one reflect. On acquaintances, visitors, keys left unattended." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure the inspector will sort it out." "Indeed," she replied, "though I wonder if the legal mind doesn't find it particularly galling to consider such an event might have been premeditated, with impersonation involved, perhaps." He hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "I wouldn't presume, Miss Marple. I deal in wills and boundary disputes. That sort of drama is more suited to novels than deeds and filings." "Yes, so many say," she murmured. "But sometimes, even the dullest paper trail can tell a very vivid story. And you were looking through your briefcase yesterday, I believe, about those land registry papers." "I was," he said sharply. "Charlotte asked me to bring them. She wants to divide the lower orchard from the main estate. It's a common matter." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh, I'm sure it is. Still, one wonders if the orchard might conceal more than just apple trees." He made an abrupt excuse and left her by the window. She didn't stop him. Back in the hallway, Inspector Granger had finished with Mrs. Beckett and was now reviewing her statement with Constable Reed. "So he gave his name as Mr. Harley," Granger repeated. "Claimed to be an old friend of the family, and you let him in." "He had a key," Mrs. Beckett protested. "He said he'd been invited. I had no reason to question him." Granger tapped his notebook. "You say he didn't come with luggage?" "No, sir. Just a small case, a shaving kit maybe. He asked not to be disturbed. Said he'd see Miss Charlotte in the morning." Granger grunted. "Strange. Very strange." "Not if he never intended to leave," said Miss Marple quietly as she entered the room. "Or if someone else intended to ensure he never did." Granger looked at her. "You've a theory, then?" "Not yet," she said. "But I do have a thought. The name Harley, it struck me as familiar. Not the man, but the name. There was a Harold Harley who worked for a property firm in London. He was involved in a rather sordid case years ago. Disappeared before trial. Embezzlement. Blackmail." Granger raised a brow. "You think our victim is Harold Harley? I wonder," she said delicately. "It would explain the alias, the lack of identification, and the sudden arrival. Perhaps someone in this village recognized him, or feared he might recognize them." "Bloody hell," Granger muttered, scribbling a note. "If that's the case, someone here had a very strong reason to keep him quiet." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And someone went to the trouble of placing him in a guest bedroom, giving him a key, and letting him remain undisturbed until he was no longer breathing." Granger rubbed his temple. "I'll have to send for records. If this is Harley, he's been missing for nearly a decade." Miss Marple turned back toward the drawing room and paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed the guests still milling about the lawn. Nora Bellamy had moved to the far edge of the garden, where the rhododendrons bloomed in heavy purple waves. She stood alone, twisting her bracelet nervously. Miss Marple made her way to her side. "A dreadful morning, my dear," she said softly. Nora jumped slightly. "Oh, yes, it's awful. I still can't quite believe it. You've known Charlotte a long time, haven't you?" "We grew up together," Nora said. "Our families have always been close. Though, well, things change." Miss Marple smiled gently. "As they do, and you were in the house yesterday afternoon?" Nora nodded. "I helped with the tea things. I went in to find the napkins. I didn't touch anything else, I promise." "Oh, I'm not accusing you of anything," Miss Marple said kindly. "But I wonder, did you happen to notice the sideboard drawer open, where the keys are kept?" Nora hesitated. "It was slightly ajar, I think, but I didn't think anything of it." "Of course," Miss Marple said, watching her closely. "Did you know a man had arrived that evening?" "Someone not invited?" Nora blinked. "No. Who?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "He said his name was Harley, claimed to be an old friend of the family." Nora's face paled just slightly. "Oh, I didn't see anyone like that." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on the younger woman's arm. "You know, dear, people often forget that hiding something is much more exhausting than confessing it." Nora swallowed hard. "I really don't know who he was, Miss Marple." "I believe you," she said gently, "but someone does." Miss Marple left her there and wandered toward the orchard. It was shaded and quiet, the trees just beginning to bud. In the distance, the low stone wall that marked the estate's edge lay sun-warmed and still. She paused near a weathered bench and sat, looking out across the hedgerow. A memory returned to her, one of those odd bits of gossip from years past about Charlotte's father, Alfred Stroud. There had been whispers, back when she was young, of a business deal gone wrong. A partner vanished, something to do with forged documents and a hastily sold parcel of land. And now, years later, an unknown man turns up with no luggage and no invitation, is placed, either knowingly or unknowingly, into a room rarely used, and is found dead by morning. Not an accident, not a burglary gone wrong. It had the shape of a reckoning, a ghost from the past returned to settle old scores. But whose ghost? Alfred Stroud was long dead. His estate passed cleanly to Charlotte, and yet Miss Marple rose and returned to the house, her thoughts sharp as the autumn air. As she stepped into the hallway, she caught sight of Gerald Ames, speaking with Lucy Mullins. They looked too close for casual friends, too strained to be lovers. She paused, listening. "You promised," Lucy whispered fiercely. "I didn't know he'd come here," Gerald hissed. "I swear, I thought he was gone for good." Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows. She had heard enough. The circle was tightening. The dead man was no stranger to at least one person here, perhaps to several. A history had returned, unwelcome, inconvenient, and silenced by force. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and moved quietly up the stairs. It was time to look at the bedroom where the man had died. Not to see the body, which had already been taken away, but to observe what everyone else had missed. The bed, the pillow indentations, the window latch, and the scent in the air, a faint trace of men's cologne, oddly familiar, old-fashioned. The kind sold by barbers in London decades ago. She leaned in to examine the bedside table, a glass of water untouched, a watch left face down. She opened the drawer. Inside, nothing but an envelope. Empty, torn at the edge. Something had been taken from this drawer. Miss Marple straightened slowly. The answer wasn't in the identity of the victim alone. It lay in what he brought with him, what he intended to say or show. Something that frightened someone enough to kill him, and Miss Marple intended to find out what that was. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the drawing-room windows, where a small group of villagers had gathered, whispering nervously amongst themselves. The arrival of Inspector Granger's black car had stirred the usual calm of St. Mary Mead into uneasy anticipation. Miss Marple, observing quietly from her familiar corner, noted the shifting alliances and the carefully concealed tensions that rippled beneath the surface. Lucy Mullins, who had seemed so composed earlier, now appeared restless, her fingers nervously twisting the lace cuff of her sleeve as she avoided the gaze of anyone who might pry too deeply. Gerald Ames, standing by the hearth, spoke with a controlled intensity that betrayed his usual charm, while Charlotte Stroud sat stiffly, her expression a mask of dignified sorrow. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were drawn once again to the space where the mystery man had lodged, the guest bedroom upstairs. She felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing upon her, each detail like a thread waiting to be pulled. Later, as the evening gathered its shadows and the villagers dispersed, Miss Marple found herself once more ascending the stairs to the empty room. The door creaked slightly in the draught, and she stepped inside, allowing her gaze to wander over the modest furnishings, the neatly made bed, the small writing desk, the wardrobe standing closed at the corner. Her attention returned to the bedside table where she had found the torn envelope the day before. Now, with a more patient eye, she searched the room for anything else overlooked. On the floor near the window, half hidden beneath the curtains, was a faintly crumpled scrap of paper. Bending down, Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. The writing was hurried and faint, but unmistakable. A list of names, dates, and places. Some of the names were familiar. Local business owners, a solicitor from a neighboring town, even a reference to a deed dispute from 20 years ago. The significance was not immediately clear, but the connection to the village's past was undeniable. Just then a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Inspector Granger entering quietly, his usual air of brisk authority softened by curiosity. "Still poking around, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone less sharp than usual. "Curiosity is a necessary tool, Inspector," she replied mildly. "I believe this scrap might hold a clue that has been overlooked." Granger stepped forward and examined the paper. "Looks like some kind of ledger or record, perhaps a list of debts or claims." Miss Marple nodded. "Or names to be remembered. I wonder if this ties back to Mr. Harley's, if I may call him that, purpose for visiting." Granger sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've already checked with the records office. There's nothing recent on any Harold Harley, but these names, some are old, some recent. It's a tangled web." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Often, it's not the web, but the one thread that pulls it all together." As the inspector left to secure the document, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's conversations. The villagers' reactions had been telling, revealing more than they intended. Mrs. Beckett's nervousness, Nora Bellamy's evasiveness, and Gerald Ames's strained composure, all pieces of a larger puzzle. Her thoughts returned to Charlotte. The woman's composure was impressive, yet beneath the polished surface Miss Marple sensed a vulnerability. Perhaps the woman bore burdens not only of grief, but of secrets long kept. The next morning brought a brisk chill, and with it, renewed energy in the investigation. At the village hall, a meeting was convened at Inspector Granger's request. The townsfolk gathered hesitantly, the shadow of the murder still fresh upon them. Charlotte stood beside the inspector, poised yet withdrawn, while Miss Marple took her customary seat near the back, quietly observing. Granger addressed the assembly. "We understand this has been a shock to everyone. However, I must stress the importance of honesty. Any detail, no matter how small, might help us piece together what happened A few hands rose hesitantly. Lucy Mullins spoke first, recounting her tasks on the day of Mr. Harley's arrival. Her narrative was careful, almost rehearsed, but when questioned about her relationship with Gerald Ames, she faltered. Gerald himself was called forward. His explanation of his presence in the village was vague. Visiting old acquaintances, he said. Yet several villagers whispered that he had been seen arguing with the victim earlier. Miss Marple's keen ears caught the subtle inconsistencies in his story. When asked about the torn envelope, Gerald glanced briefly toward Charlotte, who lowered her eyes. Suddenly, Mrs. Beckett broke down, confessing that she had allowed the visitor in under instruction, but refused to say who had told her. The room grew tense. Miss Marple rose, her voice calm but firm. "May I remind everyone that truth, like light, will always find its way through the darkest shadows." Her remark drew silence, and all eyes turned toward her. After the meeting, Miss Marple sought out Charlotte in the garden. The younger woman looked pale, the strain evident. "I know these times are difficult," Miss Marple said gently, "but if there is something you have not told us, it may be kinder to confess than to carry the burden alone." Charlotte hesitated, then spoke in a whisper. "There were things my father hid, debts, mistakes. I thought they were gone with him, but it seems they've come back. And this visitor," Miss Marple pressed gently, "he knew about these things." Charlotte nodded, tears glistening. "He threatened to expose them, to ruin what little is left of my family's name." Miss Marple's mind raced. The motive for murder was growing clearer, yet the question remained. Who would go to such lengths to silence a man no one seemed to know? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the guest room once more. A fresh examination of the wardrobe revealed a hidden compartment behind a loose panel. Inside lay a small, leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with coded notes, references to meetings and payments, and a chilling list of names marked with crosses. Among them was one she recognized immediately: Gerald Ames. Miss Marple folded the notebook carefully. The tangled web was unraveling, one thread at a time. And at the center of it all was a secret that someone would kill to protect. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, the village remained quiet, but Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities. The garden party had been the spark, but the fire now spread into every corner of the village, and the truth waited patiently to be uncovered. The notebook lay heavy in Miss Marple's hands, its worn leather binding cool against her fingers. She turned it over thoughtfully, then carefully tucked it into her handbag. Outside, the evening breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the quiet hum of village life, seemingly untouched by the dark secrets that had begun to unravel in its midst. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead's genteel facade, tension was mounting like a coiled spring. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, the sort of day that should have invited cheerful strolls and village chatter. Instead, the air was thick with suspicion and muted whispers. The news that Inspector Granger intended to re-interview several villagers had spread quickly, leaving many on edge. Miss Marple made her way to the local tea room, where she often met acquaintances and gathered news. The room was already bustling, with the usual morning crowd, but the atmosphere was charged, voices dropping to hushed tones as she entered. Mrs. Dolly Perkins, the baker's wife, greeted her with a nervous smile. "Miss Marple, they say the inspector's turning the village upside down, asking questions as if the devil himself had come to stay." Miss Marple returned the smile, though her mind was elsewhere. "Curiosity and truth are often unwelcome guests, Mrs. Perkins, but necessary ones." At a corner table sat Lucy Mullins, looking pale and fidgety, her fingers tightly clasped around a teacup. Miss Marple joined her and asked gently, "How are you holding up, dear?" Lucy glanced around before answering in a whisper. I'm frightened, Miss Marple. They think I'm hiding something, but I swear I only did what I was told. Miss Marple inclined her head. Who told you, Lucy? Lucy hesitated, then shook her head. I can't say. I promised. This cryptic response deepened Miss Marple's growing sense that the villagers were caught in a delicate web of loyalty and fear, complicating the search for truth. Later that day, Inspector Granger visited Miss Marple at her cottage. He looked wearied, the hard lines of his face softened by a hint of frustration. Miss Marple, he began, your notebook find has opened a new avenue. This coded list suggests a long-standing scheme involving debts, favours, and perhaps blackmail. Gerald Ames's name appears repeatedly, but not just his. Several others on that list have reasons to want Mr. Harley silenced. Miss Marple nodded, thoughtfully. Secrets have a way of festering until someone tries to expose them, Inspector. The question is, who benefits most from his silence? Granger sighed. A good question, and one I've been trying to answer since the beginning. But with so many tangled motives, it's like trying to unravel a knotted skein. They discussed the villagers who had reasons to conceal past indiscretions. Charlotte's family's hidden debts, Mrs. Beckett's loyalty, and the enigmatic Mrs. Bellamy, whose evasiveness grew more pronounced with each inquiry. Miss Marple suggested revisiting the scene of the crime once more, hoping a fresh look might reveal something previously missed. Together, they returned to the guest room. This time, Granger inspected the writing desk and the papers scattered about more closely, while Miss Marple's attention lingered on the window latch, which was slightly loose. Could someone have entered or exited that way? She mused aloud. Granger examined the latch and nodded slowly. It's possible, though it would have required care. The room is on the ground floor, after all. Miss Marple's eyes travelled to the garden outside, where the tall hedges created a private enclosure. A quiet place for a secret meeting, or a hurried escape. That afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to meet with Charlotte again. The younger woman appeared more composed, but still bore the weight of her burdens. I've been thinking, Miss Marple said gently, about the threats your father received. Did he mention anyone specific? Anyone you felt might wish him harm? Charlotte hesitated, then revealed. There was talk of a local businessman, Mr. Cartwright. He and my father had a bitter dispute over land some years ago. Mr. Cartwright was known to be ruthless. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Ruthless? Men sometimes resort to desperate measures. Did Mr. Cartwright have an alibi for the time of the murder? Charlotte shook her head. I don't know. I haven't spoken to him recently. Determined to follow this lead, Miss Marple set out to find Mr. Cartwright. She found him at the village shop, where he was restocking shelves with an air of forced cheerfulness. Good afternoon, Mr. Cartwright, she greeted him warmly. I was hoping to have a word about Mr. Harley. Cartwright's face tightened, a flicker of unease passing across his features. I don't know much about him, Miss Marple, just that he stirred up old disputes. Did you know him well? Miss Marple pressed. To say the least, he was a troublemaker. But I was at the town hall that afternoon, attending a meeting with other businessmen. Cartwright replied quickly. Miss Marple nodded, noting the quickness of his response. A solid alibi, then. I shall have to verify it. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple pored over the notebook again. The crosses beside names hinted at those who might have been involved in something far graver than debts and land disputes. The coded entries suggested payments and threats, carefully concealed beneath layers of cryptic shorthand. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. It was Lucy Mullins, her face pale but resolute. Miss Marple, I've decided I can't keep this secret any longer, she said quietly. I know who Mr. Harley really was and why he was here. Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. Go on, dear. Lucy took a deep breath. He was a private investigator, sent by someone to uncover what was really going on in the village. And he had a list, people who were part of a scheme to cover up something terrible from the past. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you know who sent him? Lucy shook her head. No. But he said if anything happened to him, the list must be found and made public. The weight of this revelation settled heavily between them. The tangled secrets of St. Mary Mead were deeper than Miss Marple had imagined. That evening, as the village settled under a blanket of mist, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her mind racing through the names, the clues, and the fearful faces she had seen that day. Somewhere, in the quiet spaces between words and glances, the truth was waiting to be drawn out, a truth that would unravel the carefully constructed lies and reveal the real motive behind the murder. And Miss Marple, ever patient and watchful, was ready to see it through. The following morning, Miss Marple awoke early, as was her habit, her mind still tangled with the secrets and revelations from the day before. Lucy Mullins's confession lingered in her thoughts like a delicate thread, one that, if pulled carefully, might unravel the whole mystery. She dressed quietly, sipping her morning tea by the window, watching the village stir to life beneath the soft light of dawn. The streets were beginning to fill with familiar faces, each one carrying their own burdens and secrets, as unsuspecting as ever. Miss Marple's first call was to the village solicitor, Mr. Edward Cartwright, the same man who had claimed to have been at a business meeting the afternoon of the murder. She had yet to verify his alibi, and something about his quick dismissal still nagged at her. Arriving at his office, she found the small, orderly room smelling faintly of leather-bound books and polished wood. "Good morning, Mr. Cartwright," she said warmly, settling into a chair opposite his desk. "I wonder if you might indulge me with some details about the meeting you attended yesterday." Cartwright's polished demeanor remained intact, but his eyes flickered with a guarded alertness. "Certainly, Miss Marple. It was the quarterly meeting of the St. Mary Mead Business Association. All the local traders were present, and it lasted from 2 until nearly 6 in the afternoon." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did anyone notice your arrival or departure? Could they vouch for you?" "Well, the meeting was quite formal," he replied. "There was a register. I believe Mrs. Adams signed me in." The solicitor's smooth delivery didn't quite convince Miss Marple. "Might I speak to Mrs. Adams, then?" Cartwright's smile tightened. "Of course. I shall send word for her." While waiting, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the wall, an older gentleman with a stern gaze and a familiar face. She recognized him instantly. Gerald Ames, the first name on the mysterious notebook list. "Do you often think of Mr. Ames, Mr. Cartwright?" she asked casually. Cartwright's expression flickered for a moment. He was a formidable man, firm, in his opinions, and not everyone's favorite, I admit. Mrs. Adams arrived promptly, a kind woman with bright eyes and a steady voice. "Mr. Cartwright was here all afternoon, Miss Marple. I signed him in, as I do everyone attending the meeting." That settled one part of the alibi, but Miss Marple knew appearances could be deceiving. Next, she decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Beckett, who had remained somewhat aloof from the village gossip, but had been seen near the guest room the night of the murder. Mrs. Beckett greeted her at the door of her quaint cottage, holding a freshly picked bouquet of wildflowers. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure? I wanted to ask you about the evening of Mr. Harley's death." Miss Marple began gently. "I understand you were out in the garden at the time." "Yes, I was tending to the roses," Mrs. Beckett replied. "I remember seeing Mr. Harley earlier, but I didn't expect anything to happen. He seemed rather preoccupied. Did you notice anyone else near the house that evening?" Mrs. Beckett hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I saw Charlotte Bellamy coming and going. She seemed quite upset." Miss Marple filed this detail away carefully. Charlotte's earlier story about Mr. Cartwright and her father's debts now seemed entwined with the movements of others. The web grew ever more intricate. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the village pub, the Fox and Hound, where she found a few of the local men gathered in the snug. Among them was Mr. Jonathan Bellamy, Charlotte's father, nursing a pint with a distant look. "Mr. Bellamy," she began kindly, "I hear the last few weeks have been difficult for you." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Difficult indeed, Miss Marple. Gerald Ames's death has unsettled many, but the secrets he unearthed have made it worse. My daughter's entanglement with Mr. Harley has brought suspicion where there should be none." "Suspicion can be a dangerous thing," she remarked softly. He sighed. "I only wish I knew the truth. I can't protect my family if I don't." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him thoughtfully, noting the mixture of worry and defiance. "Truth has a way of coming out in the end, Mr. Bellamy. Sometimes one must be patient to see it clearly." As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Miss Marple returned home, her mind spinning with the puzzle pieces she had gathered. The notebook's cryptic code, the list of names crossed out or marked, the alibis that seemed solid but perhaps were not, and the subtle fear she sensed in Lucy's voice all pointed toward a hidden motive beyond mere money or old grudges. She was joined shortly by Inspector Granger, who had brought new news. "We found something in the guest room that was missed during the initial search," he announced, producing a small, folded piece of paper. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. It was a fragment of a letter written in a hurried hand. "The truth must stay buried. Trust no one. They watch and wait." The warning sent a chill through the room. "Someone knew the danger," Miss Marple murmured. "And it wasn't just Mr. Harley." Granger looked grim. "We're dealing with more than a simple murder. There's something bigger at play." Over the next few days, the village's unease deepened. Rumors swirled like autumn leaves caught in the wind, each whisper adding a new shade of suspicion. Miss Marple found herself walking the familiar lanes more frequently, her eyes keen for the unnoticed gestures, the flickers of anxiety behind forced smiles. One evening, as she sat by the fire with a cup of chamomile tea, there was a gentle knock at the door. It was Lucy Mullins, her eyes wide and urgent. "Miss Marple, I overheard something today at the market. Mr. Cartwright was talking to Mr. Bellamy in low tones, and it sounded threatening. They were arguing about the list." This revelation confirmed what Miss Marple had long suspected, that beneath the polite civility of St. Mary Mead, old alliances were cracking under pressure, and desperation was creeping into the hearts of those who had something to hide. Night deepened, and Miss Marple sat back, her gaze steady and clear. The puzzle was still incomplete, but the pieces were moving into place. The truth was near, hidden in the shadows of the village's past, waiting to be brought into the light. And Miss Marple, with her quiet determination, was ready to find. Miss Marple's eyes settled thoughtfully on the flickering flames in the hearth as Lucy's words echoed in her mind. Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Bellamy locked in a private and heated conversation about the list. This was a thread too compelling to ignore. The list, after all, was the key to understanding the tangled motives that had culminated in such a tragic outcome. It was no longer merely a piece of paper with crossed-out names. It was a symbol of fear, control, and perhaps betrayal. The following morning dawned grey and misty, the kind of day that seemed to shroud St. Mary Mead in a blanket of secrecy. Miss Marple rose early and decided to visit the market herself. The village square was already bustling, vendors calling out their wares, and the hum of gossip blending with the clatter of carts and footsteps. Miss Marple moved quietly among the stalls, her sharp eyes and attentive ears absorbing the currents of conversation. She was not disappointed. The market buzzed with more than just talk of vegetables and baked goods. The murder remained the topic that consumed every whispered exchange. Mrs. Harper, the greengrocer, mentioned overhearing raised voices near the town hall the previous day, voices unmistakably belonging to Cartwright and Bellamy. The words list, silence, and consequences had been spoken with an urgency that unsettled her. Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. She made her way toward the town hall, a solid brick building with ivy crawling along its walls. It was early, and the place was quiet. But through a window, she caught sight of Mr. Cartwright entering, alone. She hesitated only briefly before following discreetly, keeping to the shadows. Inside, the building was cool and silent, but Miss Marple's footsteps stirred the dust on the floor. Cartwright moved purposefully toward the records room, unlocking the door with a key that spoke of authority and ownership. Miss Marple watched as he carefully opened a drawer and pulled out a small folder, its edges worn. He leafed through the papers inside, pausing at a particular document, then tucked it under his arm before closing the drawer with a soft click. That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple unfolded her findings. The folder contained correspondences between Gerald Ames and various village figures, including Bellamy and Cartwright himself. The letters spoke of a secret meeting held years ago, an agreement to protect certain interests in St. Mary Mead, a pact of silence forged in the face of scandal. The list, it seemed, was a record of those bound by this agreement and those who had fallen out of favour, marked for exclusion or worse. Her mind replayed the fragment of the letter they had found. The truth must stay buried. Trust no one. They watch and wait. It was clear now that Gerald Ames had threatened to expose the pact, and that his death was meant to serve as a warning. But why did Cartwright appear so confident, so unruffled? And why had Bellamy's involvement seemed so reluctant yet forceful? Miss Marple sensed a deeper game at play, one where the stakes were not merely personal, but tied to the future of the village's delicate social balance. Her reflections were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Granger, his expression grave yet respectful. "Miss Marple," he began, "we have a development that may interest you. A witness has come forward." They sat together, the inspector handing over a statement taken from a young man named Peter Dawkins, a farmhand who worked on the outskirts of the village. Peter's account was startling. On the evening of the murder, he had been passing near the old mill when he saw a figure lurking in the shadows. The man had been holding a small object, something metallic, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Though he could not clearly see the man's face, the gait and build suggested someone well known in the village. "Did he hear anything? Words exchanged?" Miss Marple asked. Peter nodded. "I heard a raised voice. It sounded like Mr. Bellamy, but I'm not sure." Then the man left hurriedly, almost stumbling. This new testimony cast a shadow over Bellamy's earlier protestations of innocence, and added weight to Miss Marple's suspicions. The next day, Miss Marple arranged to meet Charlotte Bellamy at her family home. Charlotte was pale and restless, her hands twisting nervously as she greeted Miss Marple in the drawing room. "Charlotte," Miss Marple said gently, "there are questions that need answers, and I believe you can help. Your father's involvement, your own fears, none of." "It is a cause for shame. It is simply part of the truth." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid to speak before. But yes, father has been desperate. The pressure of those old agreements, the debts, the fear of exposure, it has changed him." She hesitated, then continued. "On the night of the murder, I saw my father leave the house late, carrying something wrapped in cloth. He was tense, secretive. When I asked, he told me to stay away, that it was none of my concern." Miss Marple's heart quickened. This revelation aligned chillingly with Peter's account and suggested Bellamy was hiding more than he admitted. As the day waned, Miss Marple and Inspector Granger discussed their next steps. The list, the secret pact, the hidden tensions, it all pointed toward a carefully concealed motive, a desperate attempt to keep the past buried. Miss Marple knew the time was approaching for the subtle psychological test she had long been preparing. The truth would not be forced but coaxed out, like a reluctant confession from a wary witness. That evening she invited the key figures to her cottage for tea, a gathering under the guise of friendly conversation, but with a purpose far more profound. As the fire crackled softly and cups were passed around, Miss Marple observed each face closely, noting the flickers of emotion hidden beneath practiced calm. She spoke quietly, weaving stories of village life and long-forgotten secrets, her words gentle but pointed, like a spider's thread tracing a web. "Isn't it strange," she mused, "how sometimes those who seem most trustworthy can hold the darkest secrets, and how the fear of losing control can drive a person to desperate acts?" The room fell silent, tension threading through the air. Finally, Miss Marple turned her gaze toward Mr. Cartwright. "Mr. Cartwright, you have carried many burdens in this village, haven't you? Some that perhaps weigh heavier than others." Cartwright's composure cracked just for a moment, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Burdened, yes. But I have always acted in the best interests of St. Mary Mead. And yet," Miss Marple continued softly, "sometimes acting in the best interests can blind one to the harm being done. When does loyalty become betrayal? When does silence become complicity?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mr. Bellamy shifted uneasily. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Only that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will find a way to surface," she replied calmly. The room grew still, each person caught in the quiet gravity of her words. Miss Marple knew her test had begun, the subtle dance of guilt and innocence, the interplay of fear and confession. As the evening wore on, eyes flickered, secrets trembled on the edge of revelation, and the true depth of the village's dark pact slowly began to unravel before her quiet, unyielding gaze. The night lingered on in Miss Marple's cosy sitting room, where the soft glow of the fire cast flickering shadows over the faces gathered in uneasy silence. Miss Marple had spoken carefully, each word chosen to unsettle without accusation, to invite truth rather than provoke defensiveness. Now, the time had come to watch how the guests would respond, what cracks might appear in their composed facades. Mr. Cartwright was the first to break the silence. His voice was steady, but bore an unmistakable edge. "Miss Marple, I understand your concern, but I assure you I have nothing to hide. The agreements you speak of are from a time long past, and I have endeavored only to protect the reputation of this village and its people." Miss Marple nodded, acknowledging his statement with gentle patience. "And yet, protection sometimes requires silence, does it not? Silence that can become a cage, or worse, a weapon." Her gaze held his steadily, not accusing, but encouraging reflection. Mr. Bellamy, who had been tense throughout the evening, finally spoke, his tone low and guarded. "There are things we cannot undo, Miss Marple. The past is heavy, and sometimes it is better left alone. But the past is never truly gone," Miss Marple replied softly. "It shapes who we are, what we do, and the consequences we face, especially when it is bound by fear and secrecy." Charlotte Bellamy shifted in her chair, the tension visibly easing from her shoulders as she glanced between her father and Cartwright. The burden of silence seemed to press heavily on them all, yet no one was ready to unburden fully. Miss Marple took a slow sip of tea, then set the cup down with deliberate care. "Mr. Bellamy, earlier you said your daughter saw you carrying something late that night, something wrapped. Would you care to explain?" Jonathan Bellamy swallowed hard. "It was an old ledger, one I thought destroyed. I found it in the cellar. It had the names, the details. I meant to burn it. I wanted to end it all before it caused more harm." "And what stopped you?" Miss Marple asked. He shook his head. "Fear. fear that destroying it would only make others suspicious, or worse, anger those who benefit from keeping the past buried. I didn't know whom to trust. This revelation seemed to shift the atmosphere. The ledger was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of the entire hidden structure, the foundation of the village's long-standing but fragile peace. Inspector Granger cleared his throat. Miss Marple, we searched the Bellamy cellar this morning and found the ledger hidden behind loose bricks. It contains names, dates, and references to financial transactions that suggest bribery and coercion. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. So the ledger confirms what the letters hinted at. The pact was more than just a mutual understanding. It was a mechanism to control, to manipulate. Exactly, Granger said grimly. And it gives motive to several people who had everything to lose if Gerald Ames exposed them. Miss Marple stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the moonlit village. But it is not simply the ledger or the list that sealed Gerald's fate. It is the fear that truth, once unleashed, can destroy the delicate balance, family ties, friendships, and reputations. Her gaze shifted back to the assembled group. Now, the question remains, who among you felt compelled to silence Mr. Ames before he could reveal more? There was a long pause. Then Charlotte spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. I know. Who did it? All eyes turned to her. I was there the night he died, she confessed. I came to confront him, to plead for mercy, for my father's sake. But when I arrived, someone else was already there. The room grew colder. Who was it? Miss Marple asked quietly. Charlotte hesitated, then her eyes fixed on Mr. Cartwright. It was Edward. He was desperate to stop Gerald from speaking. I heard their voices raised, threats and accusations, then a struggle. I ran before it was over, too afraid to intervene. Cartwright's face remained unreadable, but a shadow crossed his eyes. I never meant to kill him, he said at last, voice low and controlled. It was meant to be a warning, a scare to keep him silent. Things got out of hand. Miss Marple's calm gaze did not waver. A warning that became a fatal blow. Such is the danger of secrets kept too long. Inspector Granger stepped forward. Mr. Cartwright, you are under arrest for the murder of Gerald Ames. Cartwright's shoulders slumped, the weight of guilt evident. As the inspector led him away, Miss Marple turned to the remaining guests. This has been a painful revelation for everyone. But perhaps now, with truth revealed, St. Mary Mead can begin to heal. Charlotte, still shaken, nodded slowly. I hope so, Miss Marple, for all our sakes. Miss Marple smiled gently. The past may cast long shadows, but the dawn always follows the darkest night. Outside, the first light of morning crept over the village rooftops, promising a new day, one where secrets would no longer dictate the lives of those who called St. Mary Mead home. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a tentative calm, as if the night storm had passed, but the sky still held the threat of rain. News of Edward Cartwright's arrest spread quickly, and while some villagers whispered relief, others cast uneasy glances, sensing that the surface had only just been scratched. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the fire now low and the morning light filtering through lace curtains. She mulled over the events of the previous evening, her mind as active as ever. Though Cartwright's confession appeared to close the case neatly, there remained threads that tugged at her curiosity. The ledger, the letters, the tangled relationships, they were more complex than a simple outburst of desperation. And Charlotte's revelation, spoken so hesitantly, hinted at deeper tensions within the Bellamy family that had yet to be fully explored. A gentle knock at the door drew Miss Marple's attention. It was Inspector Granger, holding a bundle of papers and a carefully measured expression. Good morning, Miss Marple. I thought you might want to see these. She gestured to a seat, and he placed the documents on the table. We've been going through Gerald Ames' belongings and found this. He handed her a worn notebook, its edges frayed from use. It's a diary, it seems, detailed and personal. We've only skimmed it so far. Miss Marple opened the diary with delicate fingers. The handwriting was neat but hurried, filled with observations about the village, the people, and, most intriguingly, entries about his concerns over the ledger and the secrets it held. One passage stood out. The past cannot be allowed to surface. Too many have stakes in silence. But what cost is silence when it turns to murder? The bed that wasn't slept in speaks of more than absence. It tells of betrayal. Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. The bed. The phrase keeps returning. It must be more than a metaphor. Inspector Granger nodded. We questioned Mrs. Ashford again this morning, the housekeeper at Bellamy Manor. She mentioned the spare room. Gerald had been sleeping there recently. She found his bed untouched that morning, though he claimed to have stayed. That seemed odd at the time. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. An empty bed, a presence denied. They exchanged a glance as the implications settled between them. If Gerald Ames had not slept in the room he claimed to occupy, then where had he been? And why? Later that day, Miss Marple visited Bellamy Manor once more, this time invited to speak privately with Charlotte. The young woman appeared more composed but bore fresh shadows beneath her eyes. I have been thinking, Charlotte began hesitantly, about what you said last night, about the past shaping everything. There's something I didn't tell you before. Miss Marple inclined her head, encouraging her gently. Before Gerald came back, before the ledger resurfaced, my father and I buried something, a secret that neither of us dared speak aloud. Gerald, he was not just threatening to expose others, he was threatening to reveal my own secret. The revelation hung heavily in the air. And what might that secret be? Miss Marple asked softly. Charlotte hesitated, then whispered, I'm not his daughter. Miss Marple's eyes widened just slightly, the kind that missed nothing but also did not betray surprise. Not his daughter. Charlotte nodded. My mother died when I was very young. Father remarried, but Gerald Ames was the only one who truly knew the truth. I was the child of an affair. Father wanted to keep it hidden, but Gerald threatened to tell everyone. Miss Marple considered the delicate web of motives this added. It explained Gerald's urgency, Charlotte's fear, and the lengths her father might go to protect his reputation. You see, Charlotte continued, if that came out, everything would crumble. The family name, the standing of the Bellamys in the village. Gerald held power over us because of that knowledge. Miss Marple folded the diary carefully. It seems the ledger was only part of the story. The threads of personal betrayal are tangled deeply in this fabric. Charlotte's eyes brimmed with tears. I don't want my family to fall apart, but I cannot live under the shadow of lies anymore. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Truth, while painful, is the beginning of healing. Sometimes it takes a hard winter before the flowers bloom again. That evening, as the village settled into uneasy rest, Miss Marple sat once more with Inspector Granger. She shared the new revelations and her reflections on the hidden tensions between the Bellamys and Gerald Ames. Granger rubbed his chin thoughtfully. If Charlotte's secret was the real leverage Ames held, then perhaps the true motive for murder lies not just in financial or social control, but in personal desperation and fear. Miss Marple nodded. And what of Mr. Cartwright's role? His confession seemed genuine, but was he acting alone? Or was he a scapegoat in a much larger drama? The inspector looked to her with respect. You think there's more to uncover? Always, she replied with a quiet smile. Days passed as the investigation continued, with Miss Marple quietly observing, listening, and piecing together subtle inconsistencies. A fleeting glance here, a half-hidden expression there. Small, clues that whispered truths louder than any confession. One afternoon, Miss Marple was summoned back to Bellamy Manor. Charlotte awaited her in the drawing-room, visibly distressed. "There's been another development," she said. "My father, he's vanished." Miss Marple's heart tightened. Vanished? Yes. He was supposed to meet the solicitor today regarding the ledger and the estate. But he never showed up. His study is in disarray, and there are signs he left in a hurry. This sudden disappearance cast a new shadow over the case, suggesting that the tangled secrets were far from resolved. As dusk fell, Miss Marple stood at the window, looking out over the quiet village, her mind turning over possibilities. The game was far from over, and the true story of the bed that wasn't slept in was still waiting to be fully told. She knew that the final pieces would come together only when the unseen threads were finally drawn into the light. Until then, St. Mary Mead held its breath in uneasy anticipation. The disappearance of Henry Bellamy was the unexpected turn in a case already thick with mystery, and it unsettled the village of St. Mary Mead more than any whispered speculation ever could. Miss Marple, who had spent many years quietly unraveling the knots of human nature beneath the calm surface of this very village, understood that this new event was not merely a flight of desperation, but a carefully orchestrated piece of a larger, darker puzzle. She arrived at Bellamy Manor shortly after word of Henry's vanishing had reached her. The manor, once a symbol of stability and tradition, now seemed a place where shadows lengthened, and the walls themselves seemed to hold their breath. Charlotte met her at the door, her face pale but resolved. "He's been gone since yesterday." "Morning," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "There's no note, no sign of where he might have gone." Miss Marple led Charlotte into the drawing-room, where the disorder in Henry's study weighed heavily in the air. Papers were scattered across the desk, books lay askew on the shelves, and a single glass, half empty, stood forgotten near the window. Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned the room with quiet precision, noting details that might escape the casual observer. A faint scent of tobacco lingered, unusual for Henry, who was not a smoker. A blot of ink on the carpet near the desk suggested a hurried departure. And on the floor beneath the window, a faint indentation in the dust hinted at a recently moved piece of furniture. "Someone disturbed this room in haste," Miss Marple murmured. "But the question is why, and in which direction Henry went afterward." Charlotte pulled herself together and said, "I called the neighbours. No one saw anything unusual, no strangers, no cars leaving in a hurry. It's as if he simply vanished." "Into thin air," Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It is rarely quite so simple. Tell me, Charlotte, was your father under any particular stress beyond what we already know?" Charlotte hesitated, then confessed. The solicitor's visit was supposed to finalize some decisions about the ledger and the estate. Father was anxious. He feared that the revelations might tear the family apart or ruin their reputation. "That anxiety may have been well-founded," Miss Marple said gently, "and if he sensed danger approaching, it might explain his sudden flight." With permission from Charlotte, Miss Marple took a closer look at the scattered documents. Among letters from the solicitor, she found a recently received telegram. Its terse wording stood out. "Urgent meeting needed. Your safety at risk. Trust no one." The telegram was unsigned and bore no indication of the sender, but its presence was significant. "Who else knew about your father's plans today?" Miss Marple inquired. "Only the solicitor, Gerald Ames, and of course me," Charlotte replied. "Gerald Ames," Miss Marple mused. "Though in custody, his influence still seems to ripple through these events. And yet, if your father feared for his safety, it might mean there is more at stake than any of us have guessed." The inspector arrived mid-afternoon, looking wearied but determined. "We've canvassed the village again and checked all known routes. No sign of Henry Bellamy or his car. The police are considering a missing persons inquiry. Miss Marple shared the telegram with him. This might be the key to understanding why Henry fled, if indeed he did. There is someone who wished him harm or feared his revelations. The inspector frowned. Do you have any suspects, Miss Marple? She shook her head. Not yet. But there are many who might benefit from silence. The ledger's secrets are dangerous, and pride often hides truths far more damaging than facts alone. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her own sitting room, the diary of Gerald Ames before her. She read once more the passages that spoke of fear, betrayal, and a bed that had not been slept in. The phrase kept echoing in her mind, now taking on a deeper significance, an absence that was purposeful, a deception carefully maintained. The following morning, Miss Marple visited the village post office, where she knew to find a quiet woman named Mrs. Pritchard, who had long been a source of village news despite her modest demeanour. Over tea, Miss Marple gently probed for any unusual occurrences or rumours. People talk, you know, Mrs. Pritchard said, lowering her voice. There's been more than the usual whispers about the Bellamys. Some say Henry's not as noble as he seems. Old debts, bad investments, and a few quiet threats from outsiders who'd like the ledger for their own. Threats from outsiders? Miss Marple asked, intrigued. Yes. There's been talk of a man, one they call Mr. Harper. Not from around here, but he's been seen in the village off and on over the last few weeks. Nobody knows exactly why. Armed with this new lead, Miss Marple shared the information with Inspector Granger. Together, they arranged for discreet inquiries to learn more about this mysterious Mr. Harper. Meanwhile, Charlotte's distress deepened. If father is in danger, then so are we, she confided. I feel the walls closing in. Miss Marple reassured her. The walls may close, but light always finds a crack. Days passed, and the investigation gradually unveiled more fragments of truth. Mr. Harper was indeed a real figure, a shrewd businessman with murky ties to the financial world beyond St. Mary Mead. His interest in the ledger and the Bellamy estate suggested that the stakes were larger and more perilous than the village had imagined. During a visit to the local inn, Miss Marple encountered a nervous waiter who recalled seeing Mr. Harper speak in hushed tones with a stranger matching the description of Henry Bellamy just days before his disappearance. This meeting, discreet and hurried, seemed to confirm that Henry had sought to negotiate or confront the external threats himself. In the quiet of the Bellamy estate, Miss Marple pieced these elements together. The ledger was not merely a record of village grievances or family secrets. It was a document whose contents could unravel reputations, ruin livelihoods, and topple the delicate balance of power. Henry's disappearance, then, was likely a desperate attempt to escape the web of danger closing around him, while the arrest of Edward Cartwright remained a convenient distraction from the larger conspiracy. Miss Marple knew that the final act was approaching. The threads, Charlotte's secret, Henry's flight, the threatening telegram, the shadowy Mr. Harper, were all connected by a silent thread of fear and ambition. She resolved to set a subtle trap, a psychological test to draw out the real architect of the deceit. She would watch carefully who sought to fill the void left by Henry's absence and whose actions betrayed the faintest tremor of guilt. The village of St. Mary Mead, though outwardly serene, held its breath as the unseen game of revelation and deception edged toward its climax. Miss Marple, calm and observant, prepared to unravel the final secret concealed by the bed that had not been slept in. The late afternoon sun cast long, languid shadows across the manicured lawns of Bellamy Manor, yet inside, the air was taut with tension and anticipation. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap as she observed the assembled company: Charlotte Bellamy, Inspector Granger, Gerald Ames, freshly released on conditional terms, and the ever-watchful housekeeper, Mrs. Tilling. Henry Bellamy had returned unexpectedly the previous evening, appearing tired but unharmed, though still guarded. His disappearance had unsettled the village, but the mystery surrounding it had only deepened. Now, as the day waned, the threads of the case were ready to be drawn taut and woven into a final pattern only Miss Marple's subtle insight could reveal. "Thank you all for gathering," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm. "There are truths among us that have long been cloaked by silence and fear, but today we must bring them into the light." She glanced at Charlotte, who sat with a nervous clasped hands, then at Gerald Ames, whose expression was unreadable, before finally resting on Inspector Granger. "The ledger you found was more than just a record. It was a map of grievances, secrets, and alliances. Each name, each entry, was a testament to the pressures Henry faced, not merely from family obligations, but from external threats that sought to exploit these secrets for their own ends." Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Henry's flight was not a sign of guilt, but of fear. Fear that his revelations might destroy not only reputations but lives. Yet the disappearance of Henry was also a distraction, a carefully staged event to shift suspicion and conceal the true danger that lurked closer than any outsider. Her gaze turned sharply to Mrs. Tilling, the housekeeper, whose hands tightened around her purse. "Mrs. Tilling, you have served the Bellamy family loyally, but you also bore a grudge against Henry. The bed that was not slept in, the very phrase that has echoed through this investigation, was your subtle deception. You hoped to convince us all that Henry had fled in haste, leaving no trace to hide the fact that you had confronted him." Mrs. Tilling's composure faltered, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "He was going to ruin us all. I couldn't let him," Miss Marple nodded unfazed. "And yet you did not act alone. You conspired with Mr. Harper, whose presence in the village was no accident. Mr. Harper, a man with deep financial interests tied to the Bellamy estate, sought to control the ledger's secrets for his own gain. Together, you intended to silence Henry before he could expose the truth." Charlotte gasped softly. "But Henry, he came back. What changed?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Henry's absence was a calculated risk. He used it to observe the village's reaction and flush out the conspirators. With the help of Inspector Granger and the police, we have now restored order. The ledger remains safe, and justice will be served." Inspector Granger stepped forward. "Mrs. Tilling and Mr. Harper will face the consequences of their actions. The truth, finally, is clear." As calm returned to the room, Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her eyes reflecting a deep understanding of human frailty and strength. The village of St. Mary Mead would never be quite the same, but life, as always, would go on, shaped by the quiet wisdom of those who see beyond the surface. And so the bed that wasn't slept in revealed not just a hidden absence, but the tangled web of secrets and lies that, once uncovered, restored peace to a troubled community.